we don't know ourselves. We only know the version of ourself that we have been taught by whatever that overculture is, whether it's our parents or our schooling or media or whatever that overculture, whatever you want to call that. That is the version of us that we know, what we have been taught. We haven't actually gotten to know us. And the way we get to know ourselves is through our sensory experience. And I think perhaps the biggest lesson I've learned is how much so many of us are struggling to know ourselves.
I'm Cindy Darnell, and welcome to The Erotic Philosopher, the podcast where we examine and explore sex and relationships through social, cultural, political, and other lenses, and find some ways to explore some very diverse erotic quandaries. Today's guest is my delightful friend and colleague, Rebecca Wong. Rebecca's been a licensed clinical social worker for more than 17 years and is certified in Terry Real's relational life therapy and Pia Melody's developmental and relational trauma therapy. Both modalities are specifically for relational healing that she uses in her work with couples and individuals. She's also currently continuing her studies in somatic experiencing. She maintains a private practice in New York, Colorado, and Massachusetts, and offers several workshops for couples, individuals, and therapists. After years of witnessing clients and having deep conversations about life, love, and legacy work as the host of the Connectfulness Practice podcast and the now archived Practice of Being Seen podcast, Rebecca realized that all the big things we struggle with, fear, imposter syndrome, not-enoughness, you name it, come back to the same thing, disconnection. And there's something that we can do about it. Enjoy today's conversation with Rebecca Wong. Welcome to The Erotic Philosopher.
Oh, thanks for having me, Cindy.
It's really great to have you here. And to let listeners know, you and I have been friends and colleagues and associates for around about 5 years now, I think.
Yeah, I was trying to think back to when it started, but yes, I think 5 years is about right.
Yeah, and we were both quoted in an article that was in a local paper in upstate New York about sex and relationships. And we became fast friends ever since. And since I've been living in the US, in New York City, we've been able to work together on a couple of projects and get things happening. So, and I've also been a guest on your podcast, Connectfulness Practice podcast, right?
Yes.
Which for folks listening, I would really encourage you to listen to Connectfulness Practice podcast. It's kind of hard for me to say.
You can just call it the Connectfulness podcast.
The Connectfulness podcast, which really takes a very, very deep dive into relationships and intimacy, which is Rebecca's specialty and the reason that I invited you on here today. So, Rebecca, I want to invite you, first of all, to describe connectfulness. Talk to us about what connectfulness is.
Yeah. Thanks for asking. I believe that connectfulness is a practice. It is a moment by moment, day by day practice. And it's practice of exploring the roots of what causes disconnection in our lives and helping us to consciously restore wholeness in ourselves, in our relationships, in all of our lives. Bring us back to that creative life energy.
Right. In your observations in the years that you've been doing this work, I mean, you take such a deep and deliberate approach in couples therapy, quite unlike a lot of couples therapists that I've seen. A lot of couples therapy can be quite it can skim the surface, and it can be a lot of putting out spot fires about, arguments about dishes or arguments about money.
Yeah, I go much deeper.
That's what you do. That's really your specialty, and I love that.
Yeah.
Talk us through a little bit about, and I know this is a huge question, but the nature of disconnection. How do we know when we're not just arguing about money and dishes and what color we're going to paint the living room? How do we know when it's more than that?
It's always more than that.
Yeah.
It's never about the money or the dishes or the color of the living room or what we should, it's always a deeper issue. Yeah. I think that's the short answer. The long answer is that underneath every complaint that we have, if we dig in there, we're going to find a deeper root. And often, the more we expose that root and we start to understand what it is, we can actually start to understand what request we might make of our partner or the person that we're in relationship with, or even sometimes of ourselves, so that we can get what we want. But
Yeah.
so often, most of us don't even know what we want.
And that's really such a fundamental thing, a huge piece of the puzzle that's missing, that we can easily identify what's wrong with you, partner. You annoy me because of this ABC. But actually finding out, well, what do I want? What do I want to be different?
Right, because so often the things that annoy us about our partners are often, and this is really hard to hear, but they're often projections of our shadow parts, of the parts of ourself that we are disowning and unattaching ourselves from, that we are
Right.
disconnected from. And
Right.
so the more we are disconnected from those parts of ourselves, the more we project them onto the other. In many cases, that's our partner. And so we go after them for the
Yeah.
parts of us that we're having a hard time with.
And that is a really difficult thing to come to grips with in therapy or just in life, being able to face the parts of ourselves that challenge us. And often it's not until we're in relationships that those parts are reflected
Right.
back to us.
Yeah.
What is it about the nature, do you think, of intimacy that flips the gaze back onto us? How do you think that unfolds?
So I guess this is where it hits back to the erotic, because I believe that we learn how to be in relationship through relationship. We learn how to be in relationship also with ourselves, in relationship with other, in our earliest relationships. And so when we go back to the earliest relationships, we're talking about like being in utero and having all of your needs met and tended to. And then the huge disruption that happens when you were born. And how so often our caregivers have mismatches in regards to being able to meet our needs or not being able to meet our needs, or how much they meet our needs, or how much they over meet our needs, or how much they don't tend to our needs at all, and all of these different pieces that continue through life set a template for how we learn how to be relational. And then in our most adult, intimate relationships, that template is one we're still trying to heal from.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we're looking back to that. And when I say it goes back to the erotic, I mean going back to the life force, going back to trying to reestablish that sense of oneness that will come if our partner were to just get it right.
Yeah. And it's so interesting because, one of the struggles that I see with the couples that I work with is how what we want in sex and what we need in relationships are often really in contrast with each other, sometimes complete opposites. And part of the struggle in that balance is, how do we manage to have either the wild, dirty, filthy sex that some people want, and simultaneously have the deep, loving, really kind of sacred connection in a loving relationship. Have you seen a lot of couples in your practice and in your training struggling with bridging the gap between the intimacy and the erotic?
Often.
What kinds of approaches and what kinds of discussions? I don't want to say solutions necessarily, because there's definitely not a one-size-fits-all solution for this situation. But what kinds of experiences and opportunities have you encountered with some of your, perhaps ex-clients or couples that you train with, that help couples expand on the dance between those 2 points of intimacy and eroticism?
I think both share something really deeply in common. But I want you to jump in here with me, Cindy, because,
Sure.
When it comes to eroticism, I look up to you a lot. And so
Thank you.
I want you to bring that piece where I may be missing it. And I want to acknowledge I may have blind spots. What I see as the really common piece here is communication.
Right.
Satisfying, intimate relationships. One thing that we do really well is we're able to say, I like this, I don't like that. I want more of this, I don't want that.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That's the crossover.
Yeah.
Being able to identify and name those pieces, I think, is fundamental, no matter what
Yes.
kind of satisfying relationship we're looking for. We're going to
Yeah.
be unsatisfied
Yeah.
if we can't do that.
And that's really the crucial thing. We're going to be unsatisfied if we can't say, I like this and I don't like that. And that is such a crucial template in both intimacy and in eroticism that people struggle with. And I guess what both of those things have in common, well, two things actually that stands out to me. One part is just being able to identify what it is that you want at that deeper level, in contrast with what the mind is telling you that you want, or what your body wants, what your heart wants, what your, let me say, soul wants.
Yes.
Might not actually fit what you think you should want.
Yeah.
Or what you used to want, or what you had once upon a time, and then being vulnerable enough to not only accept that that's your truth in that moment, and truths change, and then to say it out loud.
Yeah. And it is so big. So often, I think the part that gets in the way of knowing what we want is that we don't know ourselves. We only know the version of ourselves that we have been taught by whatever that overculture is, whether it's our parents or our schooling or media or whatever that overculture, whatever you want to call that.
Yeah.
That is the version of us that we know, what we have been taught.
Yeah.
We haven't actually gotten to know us.
Yeah.
And the way we get to know ourselves is through our sensory experiences. When it comes to knowing something, we take in information through our senses. It's what I see, it's what I heard, it's what I tasted, it's what I smelled, it's what I felt, right? Maybe there's even another level of it. It's not just 5. Maybe there's more senses, right? But so I take in information through my sensory experience, and then I make up a story about it. And then from that story, I have some emotion.
Yeah.
And from that emotion, I react.
Yeah.
So if I want to know what's happening inside of me, I have to trace back to the sensory experience, because otherwise, what's the story that I'm telling myself? Where did that story come from? Who taught it to me? What did they benefit from?
So when you say I have to trace back to that sensory experience, somebody says something to me that I take offense to.
Yeah.
But maybe I don't say it out loud at the time, because at the time I don't even realize that I'm offended. I just know that I feel something that's a bit icky or a bit irritating or a bit jarring.
Yeah.
And because I've been socialized as a woman and I've been socialized to be nice, I say nothing. But it sits there and it festers and festers and festers until it's turned into a real infection.
Yeah.
And then I say something really nasty and mean and I regret it as soon as it's come out of my mouth. And so you're saying we need to go back to the source of that.
The source of the input of the information, right? And so then the questions become, all right, that offended you. Why did it offend you? And we're just looking, like, was the incoming information, was it true? Was it directly about you?
Right.
If it was about you and it was true, is there a story behind it? Is that something that you learned somewhere? Who taught it to you? And what did the person or institution who taught that to you have to benefit from you learning the lesson in that way?
Yeah.
And so you just start to explore the information you're taking in on that sensory level and understand it better. And as you do, you start to also understand you.
Yeah.
And so then you know, if I got upset with this guy for saying this or this person for saying this, this is why.
Yeah.
And this is what my truth is.
And that's where I can see where, the root, as you're saying, of relationship struggles. And whether you're in monogamous relationships, open relationships, any kind of relationship that you're investing in, because we don't invest in all our relationships, but the ones that we do invest in, we are going to expose ourselves to a degree of sensitivity that's going to activate stuff within us. And so that's where you're saying we need to know us.
Yeah.
And in the process of relating, we get to see more our shadows, our sides that perhaps we don't see when we're by ourselves.
Very much.
Because they don't get activated, huh? Have you noticed any commonalities, any themes that seem to come up time and time again that are really prominent in all kinds of intimate relationships that are, more reflective of the human condition rather than whether people are gay or straight or queer or bisexual or whatever, that are just human relating difficulties?
Yeah, I mean, I think most things that are happening in relationships boil down to a few different fears that are just very human fears, like the fear of being rejected or the fear of being abandoned, the fear of being alone. Those tend to be the main points that are really the pain points that people come in with.
And I agree. I mean, I think these are really universal, and it's the same too, you know, in my work around sex, that the fear of being rejected, whether it's, you know, on a dating app or whether it's in a 20-year marriage, that rejection is still there, or the potential of rejection is still there.
Yes. And this is where in my work, it often comes back to early developmental and relational trauma.
Yeah.
And I often describe that trauma as the things that didn't happen that should have, or the things that happened that shouldn't have.
And I think that this is one of the really crucial things for people to understand about developmental trauma, because, you know, working from that framework, as you know, we do when we're trained in it, clients will often say, you know, oh, well, I had a good childhood, or, well, that happened years ago, or, you know, I've done all the therapy and I'm over it now. And yet still, these experiences, these wounds happen at such a subliminal level, even at a level that it wasn't necessarily a particular event, that it can even be the way a caregiver looked at us with a side eye, that just is a minor thing that happens even when we're pre-verbal. So very, very young, these things can be imprinted. And so people can say, but my parents weren't abusive. I didn't grow up in an abusive environment. And it's not even about that.
It's not even about that. I mean, it is about that. I don't want to say it's not about that.
Yes.
It is about that, and it's about more than that. We know when we've been explicitly abused or neglected, but many of us don't realize the implicit ways that we carry baggage that isn't ours, right? Because as children, we are sponges. We take in the world. We're also, because we're really vulnerable. Yeah. And so we rely on our carers to protect us. And when they don't protect us, especially when they don't protect us from themselves, our instinctive nature is to survive. And so in order to survive, we develop these different ways of protecting ourselves, of caring for ourselves. And it is those same pieces that often, those protective parts of us, that often both helped us to survive and get in the way of our adult relationships.
And that's the patterns that we develop at that young age that once upon a time were helpful as we become adults and try to merge with other adults. They cease to be useful, and they...
Right, because their purpose initially, in many ways, and I don't want to oversimplify this too much, but it's the initial purpose is to contort to keep us safe. So in other words, if we're contorting to stay safe, then the place where we're not placing our focus is on who am I?
Who am I? Because we're conducting ourselves in response to
a dangerous situation.
What's around us. Yeah. Right.
And the danger could even just be, you know, mom or dad are too busy to be, you know, they're working so hard that they're too busy to notice. And so I'm taking care of my little sibling, or I'm not going to ask for what I need because I see how hard, right? So it can be a more implicit form of developmental and relational trauma, but it lives inside of us. And it even, you know, one of my teachers talks about, like, there's these 5 different ways that our carers really need to show up for us: educationally, intellectually, spiritually, emotionally, sexually. Right? And in all of these realms, they need to be able to set limits. They need to be able to offer guidance. They need to be able to nurture us. And if any of those things are done too much, or if they're not done enough, there's a mismatch. Now we need to have mismatches, relationally speaking, because that's where we develop trust. That's where intimacy grows. It's in the repair process. Every relationship has stages of things going really well, things feeling less functional, and then a reparation process. And it cycles through that. And in that reparation process, that's where intimacy and trust can grow. The problem is, in many of our homes growing up, the mismatch happened and nobody paid attention to it. And so things never got talked about. And we learned to accept that as being okay, because that was necessary for our survival.
And then it's not, again, until we are in more intimate relationships that those things start to really reveal themselves, and we don't know why we're finding ourselves in a situation over and over and over again. What inspired you to get into this work, Rebecca?
Needing it in my own life.
Yeah. I mean, it's the same with mine, and whenever I have guests on The Erotic Philosopher, I always ask them, how did you get into this? What is it about this that excites you? And invariably, everybody says, I learned it because I needed it myself.
Yeah. I think our greatest gifts, especially as healers, come from our biggest wounds.
Yeah. Yeah.
And learning how to tend to them for ourselves. I think one of the final stages, I've once read, one of the final stages of healing is to teach.
Ah, interesting.
It's really where the integration starts to happen.
Yeah. In the process of us learning how, to consult with people around their deepest emotional wound, oftentimes our clients can be our teachers as well. Yeah. They can show us and teach us things that we don't learn in therapy school, and we don't learn in any of the programs that we train in. What are some of the things that you've learned from your clients that you didn't learn in therapy school?
There's so much. I've learned how much of a continuum that gender is, and the construct that doesn't serve everybody, no matter where they really fall in that continuum.
Yeah.
I've learned about how big power dynamics are, and how that is often something that we keep coming back to play out over and over and over again, because it's where the initial wounding is.
Yeah.
And I think perhaps the biggest lesson I've learned is how much so many of us are struggling to know ourselves.
And to see it over and over and over, and that people like you and me, and, we're in this very privileged position to see these wounds. And somebody I interviewed for the podcast who is a sex worker and has no training in therapy at all, but has spent 10 years in bed talking about very, very personal things with their clients. She sort of was saying similar things, that it's this capacity to be with ourselves, and exploring gender and exploring power and exploring who we are. These are these fundamental elements of the human condition that come up time and time again, and that once we think we know something, it can change. As we change, the more that we get to know ourselves, or as we age, or we have an accident, or we get older, or we get fatter, or we get thinner, or we, have menopause, or we have whatever, all this stuff
and that's
changes.
The excitement of it, because that work, once we learn how to make it a practice to start knowing ourselves, and it just becomes that's why I call this connectfulness. It's that moment to moment practice of bringing into consciousness the root of where the disruption is, of where the disconnection is, so that we can restore that wholeness. And so once we start to make this practice a way of life, then it actually becomes really fun, because all of a sudden there's this new part of me I get to know, and I get to explore. And here's another opportunity for me to figure something out about it. And I can recognize things like those power differentials or the gender structures. I can recognize how that's impacting the way I see myself in the world.
Yeah. And it's so crucial that how much, the gender and power piece especially come into it, regardless of how, middle of the road and vanilla we may think we are still affected by these notions of gender and power that people in the more alternative sexual communities really expand on, and they really form the crux of so much of the play that goes on. And still in the vanilla world, these dynamics are at play too. They're just sort of
implicit,
they're kind of muted, but they're still there, and they come out.
And I think culturally speaking, at least here in America, one of the things that we are really good at doing is not talking about things that are important to talk about.
That's so interesting that that's your perception, because I think Americans are very good at it, in contrast with Australia and Britain, where they tend to there's a cultural thing of not this sort of stiff upper lip stoicism kind of no, don't talk about it.
Well, but we still have a very Puritan kind of
you guys have got the Puritan thing.
And when we talk about things, we talk about certain things, but not other things. Like we could talk about being reproductive or not being reproductive and how to be abstinent, but we can't talk about how to know everybody's body parts, give everybody pleasure. Yeah. Right? So there's things that we're not talking about.
And that sensitivity around erotic pleasure, I think I think across the board that's really universal. I've yet to encounter a culture that is really down with that. Maybe the Northern Europeans are pretty good at it, but even still.
Well, I think one of the things that happens when we don't explicitly talk about it is that implicitly we send the message of shame.
Yes, indeed, absolutely.
Right? And then that's what gets carried and played out. And so we're working culturally against that shame that we're all really carrying on some level.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the things that a presentation that I gave in Melbourne many years ago was how so many of us get tricked into not talking about this stuff and thinking it's not important because nobody's talking about it. We think, oh, well, it mustn't be important. I must be the only one struggling with this. And because, the cultural narrative is don't talk about it, the implied feeling is it's not important.
There's something wrong. Yeah.
And then there's something wrong, indeed. Yeah. Rebecca, I have a letter from a listener that I'd like to share with you. Would it be okay if I read that out?
Please.
Here it is. Are you ready?
Yeah.
Dear philosophers, I'm writing because I've hit a dead end with my partner of 12 years and I don't know what to do. We love each other and we're both committed, but we get stuck on this one issue of me being the one who always has to initiate repair and change in the relationship. When I do bring it up, he does get on board, but if I don't start it, nothing changes. It puts me in a position where I feel like I'm nagging him to step up. And I know he wants to too. He tells me he does. But he avoids initiating awkward conversations and reverts to being helpless and saying he doesn't know how to fix it. Then I tell him I don't need him to fix anything. I just want him to be more responsible in steering this relationship with me, rather than waiting for me to take the lead all the time in growth and repair. I feel like if I don't do it, he would be content to just plod through life, unaware of what I'm doing to keep the relationship connected. How can I get him on board? And that's from Stuck.
Yeah, it feels pretty stuck.
Yeah. Rebecca, do you have any insight for Stuck?
I have so much that I want to explore there. And there's a few big things that are coming up for me. The first piece that I want to just say is that Stuck, I hear you and you're not alone. And then I'm going to say something that's going to be a little hard to hear, because I'm going to say that instead of pointing towards our partners, we need to point back and look at ourselves.
Yeah.
And that's so often when we find ourselves in these stuck positions where we feel like I'm doing, my partner's not holding their weight. There's often something else going on. And if we could slow down and notice, I think one of the easiest places to actually begin is to notice what your complaints are. What are you complaining about?
What are you complaining about?
Notice what it is, because inside of that complaint, you actually have a request. And if you make that request more directly, it's a lot easier. Your partner doesn't have to fix anything. You don't have to wait for them to initiate something. You just, instead of complaining, you just say, this is what would really be helpful for me. In other words, the not so spoken about message is, here's what you could do to help me. Right? So I'm going to make that easy for you by telling you exactly what it is. Right? So, dear partner, I really want you to do this. And so in order for me to make it easy for you to do this, I'm going to tell you exactly what I need for you to do. And then another really important piece that often is overlooked is that when things are going well, to cherish them, to acknowledge them, to say, I really like that. When you do that, it really makes me feel good. Otherwise, we're just leaning into a negativity bias, and there's just going to be more complaints after more complaints, because we see a pattern and we're going to try to look for proof of that pattern actually being there. That's really
true. And going back to what you were saying earlier about needing to know ourselves, so for Stuck, needing to know what it is they really want from the partner, what that request is. and that why stuck feels like they are the only one doing.
That's initiating. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have any suggestions around how stuck could begin unpacking why they are even always doing the initiating?
I would start just by noticing what they seem to always be doing. What seems to be the pattern in where the repair is needed, right? Most relationships don't have 25 different fights. They seem to have particular power dynamics that come up and show up in a lot of different ways.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Or we could even, instead of calling it a power dynamic, we could say it's that we each have different ways of seeing the world. And what we're actually struggling with is acknowledging that we have different truths.
Different truths. As soon as when you said that, I know conceptually that it's a thing. And even still, I had a visceral response that was like, ooh. That's
it's
really
uncomfortable.
It's really fucking uncomfortable.
Yeah, because my truth, if we're functioning in a world where my truth is the truth, right? And I don't have to make space for the other, for whoever it is that doesn't get on board with my truth.
Yeah.
Right? Then I can feel pretty powerful.
Yeah.
Right? But so now here we're in the power dynamics.
Yeah.
Because now I'm so connected to me needing to be right that I can't also see the rightness in you.
Yeah. Yeah. And then it becomes us versus them, me versus you. You're with us or you're against us. And that never ends well.
Right. So one of the big rules is let go of your need to be right.
Yeah. And this is where the work can get really prickly and then becomes very much unlike what we've been spoon-fed that love and relationships are supposed to be, that when you meet the right partner, everything just fits and you don't have to try and it's effortless. And
one of my teachers, Terry Real, he says that you're in the right relationship, a healthy relationship, when your partner sticks a burning spear into your eyeball.
Oh my God.
That's the moment.
Wow.
That's the moment where you acknowledge.
That's the kinkiest thing I've ever heard. And I've heard a lot of kinky things.
And the reason that that's the moment is because in that moment you realize that here you are and you have to face this pattern that you've always been trying to avoid. And there's actually an opportunity for healing. So yeah, that's kinky.
Yeah. The kinkiest thing. And staying with the discomfort of whatever is there to produce pleasure is I guess one of the definitions of kinky indeed.
And can I take that a little bit further?
You certainly can.
I think one of the sexiest things, most intimate things in partnership, where we're really in that ship together, right? Like we're really in relationship, is being able to say to somebody, I care enough about us. This is worth enough to me that I'm willing to hang out with you in a state of discord when things don't feel good.
Yeah.
I'm not going to run away from you, from me, from the discomfort.
Yeah. It's like the highest compliment.
Yeah.
I think, to be able to offer that to somebody and say, this feels shit, but I'm just going to sit here with it because you mean enough to me, we mean enough to me.
Yes.
I always love talking to you, Rebecca Wong. I always find your willingness to not be afraid incredibly refreshing. How did you learn to not be afraid like this?
I'm not exactly sure what you're saying I'm not afraid of, because my husband would probably say I'm one of the most anxious, fearful people he knows.
Interesting.
So I love being in conversation with you too. And this is a fresh perspective for me that I'm really curious about.
Right. I think so for me, because, you don't, to my impression of you, professionally and personally, if something is uncomfortable, you don't back away. You step towards it. I mean, it's like you're like, oh, here's something difficult. Let me just stick my head in the dragon's mouth. Not many people will do that willingly. Yeah. They will go into it kicking and screaming. And my impression of you is that you're not like that.
Yeah. Okay. I hear what you're saying. And I think the answer to that question is that it comes from my developmental past. and how I had to learn how to organize my being in this world. The short version is that in my family of origin, I was a scapegoat. And the longer version is that not only was I a scapegoat, but I also was the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors who grew up from a very young age hearing their stories. And so speaking up against injustice and fairness, and even in like a family dynamic where my sister would and I wouldn't, and like I had to speak up.
Right.
That was part of how I organized my worldview.
Yeah.
From a very young age. And so I think that in some part answers where that comes from.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the fact that you chose to go into it rather than ignore it, which is what so many people do, that the more we can step into it, the more we can expand, and the more we can have and create the kind of connections that we want to have, even if they're uncomfortable.
Yeah. Well, I think ignoring them doesn't necessarily make the discomfort go away.
No, that's been my experience. It makes it stronger sometimes, I think. Ignoring
makes
anything.
Us feel less powerful too.
Yeah. And certainly how that shows up around sex and sexuality. People who have an inkling about something that they know about themselves, often from a young age, they will say, I knew I was queer, or I knew I was kinky, or I knew I was, something. And they go through so many years never allowing themselves the permission to step into it because of all the cultural stuff and the social stuff and never seeing versions of themselves reflected back through any of the mainstream sources. Perhaps they see it in porn, but then they think, well, I don't want to be like a porn star. I mean, that was my story. The first time I saw Annie Sprinkle performing, I was horrified and I would say disgusted. And I couldn't work out why I was so horrified and disgusted. I was about 20 years old. And it sat with me for like 3 or 4 days. And I was like, this disgusting woman doing this disgusting stuff on the stage. And then about 4 days after, I remembered this distinctly. I sat up in bed. I woke up one morning and I was just like, oh my God, I'm like her. That's why she freaked me out so much, because she was like an older version of me.
You saw something that you related to.
Yeah, and I didn't want to. I didn't want to see it, And so being able to step into those parts of ourselves that we initially resist. And now, I mean, in my case, that became my life path. I can't imagine my life not being like this,
So you embraced the part of yourself that you initially didn't embrace.
Yeah, I didn't want to. And because it was literally the first time I had ever seen a woman completely in control of her sexuality. And it freaked me the fuck out. I'd never seen it before to that level. And it was just so confronting.
Yeah.
And it was so long ago for me now, nearly 30 years ago. But I think if I hadn't seen that, I probably would have found my way to this work anyhow, because I think it was inevitable. But I'm so grateful that I found it at such a young age, during an era where you didn't really encounter it that much, and that the mentors I had in my very early 20s and mid-20s, a couple of whom I still have, I'm so lucky that I found them at such a young age, because they helped my path to navigating sexuality evolve so much more clearly and with so much more confidence. If I had struggled through another 10 or 15 years on my own, I may not have the ease with it perhaps that I have today. But it's been, it's still been a work in progress. I'm still learning stuff.
Oh, I hope you continue to for every moment of your life. This is I think what makes us fuller, more mature humans, is that we're constantly learning. And the opposite side of that is also true. I think that the thing that most of us need to heal from is actually our own immaturity. It's the places where we're stuck and we're not learning.
Yeah. That's
right.
Really
and
true.
So most of that stuckness comes back to the things that we have to learn about ourselves and that maturing process.
It's so true. It's so true. Rebecca, I'm going to put your links in the show notes. And again, I want to encourage listeners to also tune into and subscribe to Rebecca's Connectfulness podcast. It's really rich and deep and beautiful, and she has a real variety of guests, like I do here on The Erotic Philosopher, really exploring relationships through a variety of lenses and perspectives. It's for people who want to really expand their knowledge of relationships. I really encourage you to listen to that.
Thank you, Cindy. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. Really my pleasure. I hope you enjoyed today's discussion with Rebecca Wong, and be sure to check out her work on the Connectfulness podcast, and she's also just released a brand new podcast specifically for couples called Why Does My Partner? You can check that out at whydoesmypartner.com. So she has two podcasts now, Connectfulness Podcast and Why Does My Partner Podcast, both deep dives into understanding and nurturing sustainable and nourishing relationships. Today's episode marks the end of season 2, and I really appreciate all of you who have joined me on this journey through season 1 and through season 2 of The Erotic Philosopher. I'm going to be taking a little break. I'm going to be doing some writing, and I have a few other projects that I'm looking forward to sharing with you towards season 3. I really want to invite you to continue sharing and spreading the word around about The Erotic Philosopher, because your sharing, your ratings, your reviews are really what drives our popularity and enable other people to find us. And you know how so many people struggle with sex, relationships, intimacy, and all of the complicated things that so many of us need extra support and help with understanding and processing. So please, your ratings and your reviews on Apple are really valuable to us. So I encourage you, if you haven't already, please, please, please consider doing that. That really, really means the world to us. To leave a quandary for the philosophers of season 3 to ponder, please go to my website, cindydarnell.com. You'll see the podcast tab, and there is a link taking you to a form where you can submit your quandary for our philosophers to ponder. I know from the feedback from so many of you that the questions that the philosophers answer is one of your favorite parts. So keeping that alive is really valuable to us. People really love it. And I hope that over the last couple of seasons you've learned just how diverse people's understandings of sex and pleasure can be. Nothing is too complicated. Nothing is too taboo. It's absolutely welcome here. While you're on my website, cindydarnell.com, please join my mailing list. You'll get your free Prioritize Your Pleasure workbook along with an introduction to erotic massage. And that's a great way to keep in touch with me. You can also follow The Erotic Philos on Instagram and Twitter. That's PHILOS. And you can follow me on Instagram and Twitter, Cindy_Darnell. Podcast isn't a podcast without an audience. And so thank you to each and every one of you who subscribe, who download, who listen, who tweet, who Instagram about us. All of this really makes the work of making a podcast fulfilling. And if you want other ways to work with me, I offer individual coaching, couples work, and I will be moving into group work in the not too distant future. I also have my online pleasure school, which has pre-recorded classes ready for you to take at home, starting from today, to transform your sex life and your relationships. Until I'm back here with you in season 3, please take care of yourselves and each other. I look forward to catching up with you. Bye for now, and thanks for listening.